Today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the case impact from different types of video card coolers inside of that case. This is a unique mixture of our case testing methodology, which we've now deployed on hundreds of combinations of cases and their fan configurations, and our GPU thermal testing methodology. So the goal here is not to determine who has the best type of cooler. In fact, we're using two different sources of heat for this, but different coolers, but rather to determine how the cooler affects things like CPU temperature, if you're using a tower cooler, for example, or the memory temperatures, like with the unique Founders Edition design, where there's a fan on the backside pulling air straight into the memory and the CPU inlet. So that's what we're exploring today. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Team T-Force Cardea Ceramic C440 M.2 SSD, available in 1TB and 2TB capacities with PCIe Gen 4 support for high transfer speeds. Team claims that its SSD can do sequential speeds up to 5 GB per second read and 4.4 GB per second write, or 750,000 IOPS for random reads and writes. Team rates its SSD for 3,600 total terabytes written, and the ceramic heat spreader directly conducts from the controller to help manage SSD temperatures under high loads. Learn more at the link in the description below. A couple of really important things to set out there right away. First of all, this is not a look at whose cooler is the best, because for that we need to be looking more at the individual GPU performance. So now you're talking about GPU temperature, memory temperature, which we check with probes as well, MOSFET temperature to see who's got the most efficient design, and of course acoustics as it relates to the fan profile, who's got the most aggressive profile versus more of a silent one. That's all stuff for who makes the best cooler for a given GPU. What we're doing today is we are taking two identical heat sources in terms of the wattage and comparing them head to head for just strictly, again, to look at how the airflow within the chassis is influenced by a design where you have one fan on the front that pushes that way and one fan on the back that pulls towards the cooler and the RAM, as opposed to, in this instance, a one-off test against a Strix cooler where the fins are oriented vertically. You'll often see fins oriented vertically or horizontally. It's very rare that you see what NVIDIA is doing where you get different types of angles in there. So we chose a vertical orientation for this one. It's pretty common. They're probably about 50-50 on the market. Vertical seems like it's more common. And for the GPUs themselves, it actually doesn't matter what we used, because all that matters is that we're creating the same amount of heat and we're using the same amount of power in each device. So the cooler itself is the only thing that really matters in terms of how the air is getting moved around inside the case. You could use a dummy heater for this if you wanted to. We took a 2080 Ti and a 3080, and then we specifically matched their power consumption to be almost exactly identical to each other. And that allows us to get an accurate read on where that power in the form of heat then gets distributed throughout the case. So to be very clear, it is completely irrelevant whether you use a 3080 and a 3080, a 3080 and a 2080 Ti, or what two 2080 Ti's even with this cooler transplanted. All that actually matters is that the heat load's the same. So we've controlled for that. We had a few different locations in the cases and outside of the cases where we configured thermocouples, so probes for measuring the air temperature in those regions. We're using Lancool 215 from Lee & Lee for one set of tests. That's an airflow case. It has two large 200 mil fans, and that means that the air is dispersed rather evenly at a much lower static pressure than you'll get with a bunch of 120 fans, where it creates more of a funnel into whatever component it's in front of. We also have a P400A for the opposite, for more of a funnel. And then we've also taken a P400A, but put a P400 panel on it while retaining the same fan config. And then we took tests of the cards in both horizontal and vertical positions for the previous two cases. So there's a lot of stuff in here. And we've got vertical orientation, we have horizontal orientation, and we have a few different cases, including a closed panel case. So we can take a pretty conclusive look at how the coolers behave. Again, there are millions of combinations for how you could do this type of testing. So the numbers will vary depending on what CPU cooler you have, what case you have, and obviously what GPU you have. But from this, we will be able to extrapolate a pretty wide reach of how the coolers behave and which ones are more effective at cooling in particular ways, depending on what those ways are as we talk through it. As for methodology, it's mostly the same as our case testing methodology, including some of the components, except we've changed a few things, like the cards, obviously, and we're using a looping 3D Mark workload that's frozen on a particular render frames so that we have the same amount of power being pulled and consistent frequency for the GPUs. We have controlled the GPU fan speeds so that they are both at 40 dBA. This was a matter of just kind of talking internally, what are we trying to show here? We decided it would produce the most fair comparison, since they're totally different types of fans and amounts of them, to fix them to the same noise level. So they are noise normalized at 40 dBA at about a 20-inch distance, and that is in our standard GPU review methodology if you want to learn more about that. Case fans were all 100% controlled for this, so they were at full speed. The CPU cooler fan was set to its usual speed that we use for case reviews, and the rest of the methodology follows the case review methodology, which we've had in the field and deployment for several years now, probably approaching 5, maybe 4 years, something like that. Might be more. But that's what we're working with. One additional change is the power supply did have to change for one of the tests, and that's because we needed more power available to us for some of the higher clocks. To control the power consumption of the cards, we use the power slider in Precision, and we're able to then either boost up the 2080 Ti and its power consumption to about 300 watts, and this one to 300 watts, and equalize them. Or in one test with the closed panel, we brought them down to 240 watts. We're gonna get into some of the data now and talk through that before talking more about the testing. But one final major thing to make sure is very clear with everyone, this is not data that is meant to be compared to our case reviews. We've changed the GPU, obviously. And it's not really data that's meant to tell you which card is better. Again, it's just the same heat load. So we've already equalized one thing, we've changed other components in it, and we're looking ultimately at how the coolers impact the case airflow. Want to make that really clear. This doesn't tell you whose cooler is better. It doesn't tell you what 3080 is better. It doesn't give you a general idea overall, because for that you need to look at cooler level performance in a controlled bench for things like MOSFET, memory, GPU contact, levelness, all that stuff, flatness. We'll talk about that in cooler reviews. And you also shouldn't be comparing these charts head to head, one chart to the next in this methodology, even because some other parameters change, and this is not a case review. We have case reviews if that's what you want. The Lancool 215 case will start us off, which is a mesh enclosure that leverages two 200mm fans for intake. This means that the fans are naturally lower static pressure, but much more even for airflow over the body of the chassis. Starting with thermals related to CPUs, the CPU inlet temperature was 3 degrees higher on the 3080 flow-through FE design, with inlet temperature lower on the more standard tri-axial Asus design when power normalized to the same wattage. Remember that this probe also accounts for the temperature of the air near the RAM, because we've actually fished it through the RAM and it's sitting just above it and just in front of the CPU intake. The RAM, especially because it's passively cooled, is maximally a few degrees higher than it might otherwise be, and therefore this difference is largely irrelevant to all but serious memory overclockers. It's very unlikely that this matters to anyone who's using XMP or doing some lightweight overclocking. The CPU core temperature averaged out to be only 0.6 degrees Celsius higher with the FE design. Remember, the tower cooler is still exposed to heat off the backside of the GPU in either configuration, and so there's some drafting off the back of the Strix and into the middle of the tower cooler. That's why this number doesn't scale linearly with inlet temperature for this case. The large front fans also help disperse the air. As for the chipset, that's where we saw the biggest difference. The chipset temperature increased by 13 degrees with the Strix cooler, which is something we tried to point out several times over the past few weeks. We saw a lot of commentary specifically speculating about vertical orientation, which we're going to get to momentarily, of this design in a case where people were very concerned that this fan pulling air straight into the motherboard was going to be a problem. One of the comments that I personally saw was someone saying motherboards aren't built for heat. Well, maybe, but motherboards also don't really care about heat in most locations. There are capacitors with ratings, of course, for a certain temperature, but that's not going to be affected in any meaningful way by this. The only thing you're really talking about is going to be potentially M.2 or chipset temperatures. And here's one of the points we tried to make in a previous comment, but it was brief. With a standard cooler, like a tri-axial Strix cooler, for example, that has vertically oriented fins, the air as it gets pushed into the cooler is obviously going to follow the path of the fins. It can't escape out the sides because there's a wall blocking it. Some of this air will escape out that side because it's right at the edge of where the heat pipes end and where the fins end. Some of this air will escape out that side. But for the most part, almost all of your air is going up and down. And with that, what this means is that when you install a card horizontally into a case like this, and we've got plenty of footage of these installed in cases too, your air is going to go into the board already. So this isn't new. it's pretty much always done it that way, unless you have one with horizontal fins, in which case it goes out the sides. You're still gonna have some exhausting into the board though. The board's very close. These cards overhang the slot pretty far, and there's a channel between the slot and under the cooler where some of that air is going to rest, regardless of the fin orientation. So that's what we're seeing here. The air from the standard cooler was already exhausting straight into the PCA, the chipset. Doesn't matter if it's AMD or Intel, completely irrelevant. And also, therefore, into whatever M.2 device you might have under the video card. So if you're really worried about SSD temperatures for some specific reason, you know there's a reason to be worried about it, and it's not just because you read something online, but because you've experienced something with your setup, then really what you need to be watching out for is vertically oriented fins and an SSD right under the card. If you're not worried about it, other than because you saw some post online, then you probably don't need to worry about it too much, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. Back to the chart, the chipset runs much hotter with the normal cooler because of not just direct exhaust, but more importantly, very close exhaust and nowhere for that air to go. Vertical mounts will actually be better because the PCH won't be butted against the bottom of a bunch of fins that are radiating heat and trapping it. And having a fan spinning here will obviously help keep it cooler, but in terms of relative performance, isn't going to change the comparison. For GPU exhaust, the horizontal fin orientation of the FE card shows that immediate exhaust runs at about 23 degrees over ambient, or 44 degrees Celsius when you add that back in our environment. So the standard cooler is 14 degrees over ambient by comparison. Less air is able to get out of this pathway, and so it must escape somewhere else from the chassis where we might not have a probe hooked up. It'll probably spread about everywhere. And to be clear on this point too, before someone takes this number, the exhaust temperature, and thinks that it means this cooler is going to make your room hotter, it's all heat ultimately. Your computer is just a giant space heater. Almost everything you do with it is going to become heat. There are very few other things it can become. It doesn't move. For the most part, it doesn't glow, at least not in a relevant way. And in terms of turning the energy into something else. And so you're left with heat. It is a very near 100% heat, power in to heat out equation with a computer. It's not quite there, but it's close enough that anyone who says otherwise is being pedantic in a way which is 100% irrelevant. Everything that your computer does is eventually going to end up in your room as heat, and whether or not it's exhausted out of one spot or exhausted out of the whole case in various nooks and crannies, it's all going into the room. Finally, for GPU inlet temperature, we measured 13.3 degrees delta T over ambient for the standard cooler, or 8.9 for the FE cooler. The GPU inlet temperature was higher on the standard cooler due to an increase in warm air hitting the motherboard and reflecting off of it. There was higher risk of recirculating already warmed air with this design than with the FE. That does not mean the FE design is better, and it doesn't even mean that it's necessarily good. We're not saying either here. That would be a GPU cooler review. What it does mean, what it tells you, is that the air is moved around in a different way. So what determines whether a cooler design is good will again hinge more heavily on things like efficiency, meaning performance at a given noise level, or just the noise profile in general, or things like how good the contact is between the VRAM and the memory. So that's really what dictates if a GPU cooler is good. We're only focusing on the impact to other components in the case for this one. Just again, saying it a lot, but because we know it'll be misrepresented online if we don't. Next is the P400A with a mesh front panel and vertical card positioning. Remember, these numbers should only be compared on these charts individually, not cross-chart, because we are making some tweaks to our testing variables for each test case. This makes for the best data that is the most realistic per configuration, but it means it's not comparable cross-config. We chose the P400A specifically because its mounting kit positions the GPU distant from the glass, and so it isn't nearly as bad as other vertical mounts. In the past, we've done case reviews where we've shown that vertical mounts are not, in fact, universally bad. When the vertical mount positions the video card and sandwiches it right against the glass, that's when it's bad. There's no room for it to get any air, and when it distances it from the glass, say about an inch, maybe a couple inches, then you actually may end up with better performance. And a few reasons for this. One is because now you're not exhausting heat into a motherboard, which will get recirculated. It's going down and maybe into the power supply if it's flipped up, or into the power supply shroud, or into the bottom of the case. Another option is if you have an SL600M, and you're forcing air up into the case rather than in a traditional configuration. Now you're completely changing the dynamics of it, and a vertical mount is actually better because you're putting the card closer to the intake. The PCH temperature in this chart remains higher on the Strix card even when vertically mounted. This is because it's passively cooled, Actually, most Ryzen chipsets are also passively cooled because the fans are often in a no-spin mode until they're heavily loaded. So the fan's there, but with newer BIOSes, the fans will stay quiet or off until under a more severe scenario. In passive scenarios especially, the added airflow from the 3080 flow-through FE design is more beneficial than stagnant air sitting underneath the GPU shroud. Thermals for the PCH were 3 degrees lower with the FE cooler because warmed air was still more effective at cooling the PCH chipset than purely radiation alone would be. The average core temperature also for the CPU that is also plotted a significant 2.4 degrees higher with the Strix card at 9.4 versus 7.0. This is pretty easy to explain as well. The reasoning is because the Strix card now has its vertically oriented fins directly adjacent to the CPU heatsink fins, and so it is now spitting its air instead of into the glass, straight into the CPU tower cooler. This is something we've covered in case reviews numerous times in the past, and it's not really a surprise here. The fins are adjacent to the other fins, and so they're influencing each other. The CPU inlet temperature is also higher in this configuration since the FE card is mostly pushing its air into the PCH. So we end up with more clean front intake air for the CPU. Finally, GPU exhaust is unsurprisingly much warmer for the FE cooler because it has a direct outlet from the PCIe slot. This is the closed front panel test of the P400A. It's the same fan configuration as the P400A, except with the P400 non-A panel. Cards are horizontal here. The heat load is reduced to 240 watts in this one, as we were thermally throttling otherwise and dropping clocks due to the poor case ventilation. So again, not comparable to previous charts. For this one, the PCH temperature ran a 4-degree gradient, so there wasn't much change. The CPU inlet temperature was about the same between them, so hotboxing the system allowed most of the interior to reach equilibrium over the half-hour or so test period. The GPU inlet was an exception here, where the Strix ran warmer due to recirculation of warm air exhausted from the bottom, then taken back into the fans before escaping. The case exhaust also shows this difference, as expected. Overall, the differences with the closed panel were the least significant out of all the tests. You should use a better case, as we've discussed before, but a bad case with either one of these cards does not seem to produce a benefit which we can measure. The CPU temperature was within variance and measurement error, and so the fact that the 3080 exhausts more efficiently at the PCIe slot didn't actually benefit the CPU temperatures. Here's the P400A horizontal installation chart. The PCH temperature is still benefited by the FE cooler at 10 degrees reduced from the Strix cooler and its vertically oriented fins. Again, it's the difference of radiation and trappage for FE versus trappage and direct heat exhaust from the Strix. The CPU core temperature did run higher, finally, for the FE card in this test. This is counter to the CPU intake temperature, which is higher on the Strix cooler. We looked into it, and analyzing some footage from our Schlieren photography setup from when we had a front fan and a rear fan both mounted for the setup, we noticed that the airflow path takes a sharper angle from the rear GPU fan into the CPU cooler. In other words, this is a matter of test setup. We think that the warmed air from the FE card is getting guided just under the thermocouple and into the cooler. So if we had positioned the thermocouple perhaps at a 45-degree angle down and left, out of the fan that is, we might see higher inlet temperature at this point as well. So that should be a fairly definitive look at how these types of cooler designs influence performance in a case. Again, there are literally millions of configurations. It's not hyperbole of this type of setup. You have all the cases, you have all of the coolers, and then you have all the GPU coolers. And just adding one more, adding a horizontal fin cooler, would also influence the data. The primary takeaway that you should be looking at is that, one, a vertical oriented card with the fan blowing or pulling air into the motherboard, as far as our testing shows, does not influence the thermals of the chipset or an adjacent M.2 device in a way which is meaningful. And in fact, it is possible that it'll cool better because any airflow, even if warmed, is better than no airflow at all. Two, obviously, not all of the air is going through that fan anyway, and not all of the heat from this entire card or GPU is going through that fan. A lot of it's escaping out of the back of the case, and when it exits that direction, you don't have to deal with it hitting the chipset or the M.2 device to begin with. Another consideration is, again, with vertical mounts, as we've shown in a lot of case reviews in the past, you are now with a vertically oriented fin stack exhausting your air straight into your CPU tower cooler, or if you have a top exhaust radiator, it would go into that as well. So that will influence the thermals of the CPU die reading, And a lot of the time it's not necessarily meaningful, but it's something to look out for. The bigger change, obviously, with the vertical mounting is that you're pushed up against the glass, and that's meaningful. So that matters more typically than the CPU influence. But there is CPU influence too. Even with horizontal fins on this, you're still going to be dealing with just normal passive radiation, where fans in the front of the case or on the CPU tower or wherever else in the case will pull this air that's sort of steaming off the back of the GPU into some other cooler or out of some channel in the case. So the FE card, we don't necessarily recommend the FE card. You'll have to watch our cooler reviews for all the different 3080s as we get them out for which ones we think are the best. Our primary decision-making factors for those relate back to efficiency of the cooler, the noise levels of the cooler, so noise normalized performance, power normalized performance. That's a different story entirely. We're not saying necessarily that you should go buy this, if you can even find it in stock, that is, but eventually it will be there, and this content will be useful for those people in the future. We're not necessarily saying this is better than that for cooling a GPU. But what we are saying is that thus far, this has not influenced the chipset or the memory or the CPU temperature in a way which is necessarily meaningful. And in fact, in a lot of the data, it is technically superior to the vertically oriented fin stack of the Strix design, where the exhaust is going straight into some of those devices. Or in other cases, just spewing all over the case. So that should answer most of the questions about it. And there's, again, an infinite amount more that could be done here, but we're going to cap it here. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more as always. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. And we'll see you all next time.